So what about today? Today we're gonna have a short introduction on what is OSOR and what that we do. I know I see lots of, let's say, names that we already met in the past, so we'll try to be very brief on that. Then we'll move on to setting the context and the background of these events. So we'll be introducing very shortly the share and reuse of IT solution framework, just to give you a bit of understanding on the angle that we'll be addressing throughout this webinar. After that, we'll leave the floor to Kristo and Matthieu for their presentation. Each of them will be followed by a Q&A session. At the end, we'll have a panel discussion, so we'll be addressing questions to the speakers. And in both parts, so the Q&A and the panel discussion, you are more than welcome to ask any question that you might have throughout the chat, or just taking the mic and address the question yourself. And at the end, we'll have the usual conclusion, some announcement on the next publication, and some questions for you on what you would like to see in the upcoming OSOR events. So very briefly, what is OSOR and what is that we do? OSOR stands for the Open Source Observatory of the European Commission, and since 2007 is providing free and open source expertise and information to public administration across Europe, but also beyond. The activities that we carry out can be clustered in three main groups. The first one is the promotion of open source and its uptake within public administration. The second one is more related to the connection of public administration with other relevant stakeholders and useful resource. And the final one is the engagement with the community. So we organize events as this one, and we participate at events across Europe to connect with the community. One of the main resources that we are proud of is our Knowledge Center. Within this Knowledge Center, you can find a plethora of different resources, starting with the Open Source Country Intelligence. The Open Source Country Intelligence is a collection of fact sheets on the different member states, additional 17 countries across the globe. And in each of the fact sheets will be providing a snapshot of the situation in the specific nation in relation to open source. So we'll be sharing with you insights on the legal framework, actors, and different ongoing initiatives in the country. The second resource is the Guidelines for Sustainable Open Source Community. In there, you will find a set of recommendations as well as case studies on how to create and maintain a sustainable community, open source community within the public sector. But if you're interested in case studies, we have also a dedicated session for case studies where we also more than 100 different case studies showcasing the benefits and the good practices when adopting, developing, or deploying open source within public administration in Europe and beyond. In the specific resource, you will find point of contacts when it comes to open source. So it might be organization from the public sector or the private sector supporting the adoption of open source within the public sector. Each resource is clustered by country. So if you need any information on specific member states, you will easily find it there. The last two group of resources are the open source strategy, where we collect the latest information on the Commission open source strategy, and then the open source repositories, where we basically collect the information on public sector repositories related to open source and provide you with an easy access to them. Just to give you an idea on what you can expect while landing on OSOR page, you will find lots of the resources I was mentioning before, starting with the Knowledge Center and additional ones. For instance, here you can find always new information and articles on open source in public administration throughout Europe. You can also check for events. across Europe and beyond. Usually we tend to collect information on events in English, but when very relevant, there might be also promotion of events in other languages. Here you can also find a dedicated page where we store all the information related to events. So if you missed any of OSOR events, you can go to the OSOR and community events page, as you can see on the left side, and there you can find a summary and recording when available. And finally, we also publish a monthly newsletter where we just summarize the main publication for the month. So news items, events, application of other kind as case studies or studies, and also a section on solutions of the month where we promote open source solution created or deployed by public administration. This was just a brief overview on what we do. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask us. But the core topic of this event is understanding why we are talking about sharing and reuse and open source under the same umbrella. As Monica mentioned at the beginning, OSOR is included in the broader action of the Commission, that is the sharing and reuse action. And one of the products of this action is the sharing and the use of IT solution. The framework is a bit broader, so it goes beyond the use of open source. So it's in general how to foster reuse and sharing of public IT solution of any type. And of course, as for the benefit of sharing and reuse, I'm pretty sure that the majority of you are pretty familiar with them. But just to go through them once again, when sharing and reusing of IT solution, public administration can benefit from a reduction in terms of development cost, because of course it's possible to reuse building blocks from other solutions or existing solution ready to be deployed. Additionally, there will be an increase of efficiency and interoperability, especially in this process of digitalization of public administration. And lastly, by reusing existing solutions, there will be also a faster delivery of public services. So in this context, just to provide some additional info on the framework per se, is a collection of recommendation addressed to public administration, where you can find practical recommendation on how to foster the sharing and reuse of IT solution, together with the specific reusable resources for public administration. The recommendation per se and the resources are addressing not only the technical challenges that are pretty common when talking about IT solutions, but also additional challenges related to organizational matter, legal elements, as can be, for instance, the adoption of a specific license, but also when it comes to community engagement and raise of awareness. So in this framework, we selected a set of specific recommendations that are more focusing on open source. And here on the screen, you can see a general, let's say, summary. The first one is in relation to the supporting of community contribution to open source. Here the key message is that the involvement of communities in the development and maintenance of IT solution foster competition, usually between service provider, and increasing the quality of the solution adopted by public administration. And here is when we talk about supporting community, we are not only referring to simply provide code, but it also refers to indirect support, as for instance, the choice of the license, or how to engage the community, or how to set up the governance. The second recommendation is more related to fostering of open source software community. Within this recommendation, we can find tips and good practices that central bodies can deploy to increase the interaction with open source community. So how to start a community, how to maintain a community, how to support maybe public administration that are approaching the open source ecosystem for the first time. And if you're interested in this specific topic, or the guidelines I was mentioning before that were produced by OSOR last year and will be updated this year, can provide also some additional insights in this regard. The third recommendation is related to deployment of governance to support the contribution to open source. We know that governance is an essential pillar of open source communities per se, but when it comes to defining governance, it's also important to keep in mind that it's important to standardize, define processes, also the way in which IT solutions are described or published in order to increase visibility. So here it's a definition of processes and also, let's say, standardized way to describe the different solution. And lastly is the use of code repository to share IT solutions. So to provide a single point of access where public administration can find apologies for that. Can find the correct mapping and identification of open source software and building blocks. So why we're talking about these recommendations? So we wanted to highlight the main key takeaways that you can find in the sharing and reuse framework, but it's not the core topic of this event. The core topic is understanding and have an overview on what's going on in Estonia and France when it comes to good practices related to open source. So we wanted to just provide you an overview of what you can find in the sharing and reuse framework. And the speakers that will follow in a second will provide you with practical information how these recommendations were put in practice. So without any further ado, we'll introduce the first speaker. As Monica said, Kristo Vaher is CTO for the Estonian government, but he's also worked as a senior engineer, technology team lead, consultant, and technology architect for different fields as banking, government, and internet media. He's also spent more than 20 years creating multiple applications and design numerous information systems for professional and private use. He's also a great believer in the agile methodology, and he provides consultancy services to startups and developers. Kristo is currently working as Chief of Technology for the Estonian government, spreading the long-term architecture and technology vision of the organization. And today, he will be sharing with us the management of the Estonian government repository and the deployment of a governance model for open source software. Kristo, will leave the floor to you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the previous presentations as well. It's really great to see that. I would say that the new leaf is kind of being turned in Europe in terms of open source and its possible value. And I'll gladly talk about this, not just within the framework of today's webinar, but I'd love to talk about this for days, if not for months. But I do have a few slides here prepared as well. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully everything works as expected. As you know, CTOs likely have the most issues in terms of technology. So I hope that everybody sees the screen. I'm going to be talking about the Estonian experience while using and sharing open source software. As I was introduced as government chief technology officer, yes, this is the role. I'll get back to my own slide in a minute or two. But I would like to start with one of the sort of core principles that I strongly believe in. And this is that if you build and pay for software with taxpayers' money, and this software includes intellectual property of public sector, then demand it to be open source and also consider making it public. There's a lot to unwrap here, but this is something that we have written, not in the exact same words, but in our digital agenda for the next 10 years, that this is a strategic goal, that everything that we actually build with taxpayers' money, and while also employing public sector intellectual property there, then it should be open source. Whether it should be published or not, this is another issue. These are two separate issues. Whether something is public or whether something is open source. They need separate, I think, addressing in some ways. But they can be related, but they need not be. But it definitely should be that it's open source as the requirement for anything that is being essentially paid for by taxpayers' money. One of the key issues here is that people often think that intellectual property is the code, the software code, whoever is actually building the software, that this is actually the intellectual property. But this is not true. This is the result also of intellectual property. If public sector is essentially giving guidance, setting up functional requirements, setting up, defining the processes, how a software should actually work, and software engineers are actually building writing it all down and making it actually happen as a automated software, so to speak, or solution, then it still includes public sector intellectual property. So only the things that companies create themselves, entirely themselves, for very specific need that they figure out themselves how something should work, is an area where public sector cannot essentially or should not demand that this be made open source. But if public sector knowledge, awareness, experience, and functional definitions are included, then there's also public sector intellectual property applied. And there's a very reasonable expectation that this kind of procurements or solution should be open source. Whether they should be published or not, this is another issue. The second thing here is that one of the key fundamental reasons why we strongly believe in this is that if something is being paid for by taxpayers' money, then if it's made open source and if it's made public, then this is a potential opportunity for the taxpayer, whether it be a company or whether it be a citizen, a potential opportunity for them to perhaps pick it up, improve, maybe perhaps do their master's thesis or doctoral thesis on it, or maybe build a company around it and start offering this kind of solution as a service, making it better, higher quality, and possibly cheaper for the public sector to use rather than having to run it themselves. It's a huge opportunity that is not being taken advantage of enough. That actually whatever intellectual property that we're building, whatever services that we're building, that this is an opportunity for extra growth for companies, for citizens, for academia, and of course for public sector. So I wanted to start with this core principle before getting to my own slide. It's an interesting experience to be an engineer and solutions architect. What happens with engineers and solutions architects who can actually be passionate about stuff and be fond of public speaking like we're doing today, then apparently you're being given leading positions and as this driving force for larger areas and larger visions and strategy. This is incredibly fun and interesting experience for me, but I'm still at heart an engineer. I still love writing code. I don't write code daily for work anymore, but I do write it in my sort of private life almost every day, if not every day. And this is really fun for me. So I think it's valuable to be aware of what the engineers are going through and where the actual value lies. And this is what I'm actually bringing in principle towards these open source policies and practices as well in Estonia. But I'm not going over this slide thoroughly. This is the roadmap of Digital Estonia. I'm sure that most of you are aware of a lot of those achievements that are being listed here. We did regain independence in 1991. This is very important as a roadmap for Digital Estonia, because what it enabled us to do is it enabled us to look at government as well as digital government and hopes for digital government from a sort of fresh angle. This was incredibly useful for us because the timing was almost perfect in terms of digitalization and the advancement of technology towards personal computing. This was incredibly sort of a dumb luck, so to speak, but this is something that has really benefited Estonia. So we've done a lot of achievements as a result of being able to build stuff in a way where the bureaucracy or regulations were not the things that were holding us back at that time. So we've been able to do a lot of stuff from our chip-based ID card to electronic voting to actually state use of blockchain, actually in 2008, which we're still using today. This was the year before Bitcoin even became a thing. And other achievements, our core focus is now on AI strategy and what we're calling Bureaucrat Virtual Assistant. And Bureaucrat Virtual Assistant is something that we're also building on open technologies, and all the components that we're using, both code as well as the building blocks of essentially the language models and machine learning models are also being made open for public use and sharing. And the important part about Digital Estonia here is that the core foundational digital technologies of Estonia, including our electronic identity, including our data interoperability platform X-Road, are public open source. And there's a lot hidden behind this sentence, but one of the key things that matters in this is that our foundational layers are open source. And I always love saying this, is that if your foundational layers are open source, then you better have a very good excuse to have stuff on top of it that is closed source. Because in terms of security, in terms of governance model, if everything that you're building upon is already open source, then what benefits gives you the closed source stuff on top of it? It very clearly maps with my the original quote that everything that is being built for public sector and for public sector intellectual property should be made open source. I'm a strong believer in that, and one of the reasons for this is also that Estonia's core foundational digital technologies are open source. And I think this is a very important part, because what open source does at this core foundational digital technologies level is that it ensures trust. Because every kind of digital technologies that are being used, digital services that are being used, they start with trust. And open source assures some form of trust. It's not that every citizen is going through the lines of code of our open source solutions. That's not happening. But if they know that this is open, that academia and other companies have access and availability to sort of see and get into this, then there's more trust. So being it so that the door is not locked is a way to ensure trust to your citizens, especially, I think, not just in Estonia, but in Europe as a whole. So the stuff that the government builds should be as transparent as possible, and open source is one of the core ways how to do this. I'm going to start with one of the use cases that we're actually dealing with. A few years ago, we set up our own public code repository. This is different from the JoinUp. This is essentially Estonia's sort of our own GitLab deploy, again, based on open and free software. And we call it Koodivaramu, which is code repository in translation, and e-riik or e-riigi, which is our digital government or e-country, e-government type of thing. So we set this up as a way of offering a platform where public sector code that is Estonian specific is to be published and made available. There are multiple details here that are in Estonian because the screenshot is of Estonian. It's meant to be for Estonian public sector. I'm going into some of the issues that we've learned as are problems for us. But the idea there is that we created the platform for public sector code. We also intend to do another platform, which is for binary deployments, what we are calling as sort of these, not code repository, but sort of binary depository, so to speak, where you can publish stuff that isn't code or that isn't human readable, but that can be shared, so that every kind of like data models or AI models that you would actually want to reuse and share, for example, understanding language or making decisions that have been machine taught, so to speak, that you can share those things as well. They don't immediately map into code repository like Git or GitLab because there are not lines of code that you can actually read. But these are like binary knowledge and binary knowledge-based value and services that you can actually, or building blocks, so to speak, that you can also share in public, so that you don't have to start training some of the models again from the ground up. You can already pick something that has been trained with, for example, taxpayers' money. It's a huge thing because it's very critical to make sure that this happens not just with open source code, but also publicly shared models in the time where AI is becoming rather immense area to focus on, not just in private sector, not just for Google and Facebook and Amazon, but also for public sector. It's strongly tied with our focus on virtual assistants becoming a huge thing, which is part of our AI agenda as well. So it's about two things: public code repository, but also the binary repository. We are in the middle of getting binary repository up and running. We haven't launched it yet, but we are getting close to it soon. But it's important to understand that in terms of open source software, it's not just about the lines of code being published, but also the binary models that can be reused and binary components that can be reused. It's a separate issue that needs to be discussed, I think, in Europe as a whole also, because the governance model is slightly different, because lines of code can be understood by academia, but possibly the generated machine learned knowledge is harder to understand. And it requires slightly different governance model as well as security model. But this is, I suppose, a discussion or a topic for another panel. But I want to raise it on top of the, I want to raise it here so that it's understood that it's just not about just open source code. It's also about sort of public free to use models and binary models that you would like to share, because these two things are going to be playing partners to one another for years to come. Some of the clear lessons that we learned is that if you build it, they will not come. I'm sure there are a few people here that know this from a movie that Kevin Costner said in the 80s. I think it was 80s, or if not early 90s, where he said that if you build it, they will come, about building a baseball field. Google has said that if you build it, they will not come. So just making stuff open and public and just making it out there is definitely not enough. And this is one of our experiences as well. And I'm going into this in this slide. Public code repository koodivaramu.eesti.ee was launched in 2019. It's accessible over our electronic identity, which means the electronic plastic identity that we have, everybody that has it has access to this. So you don't need to create a new account. This is a huge benefit because this means, again, that everybody can contribute without having to create a new account. It also gives some kind of assurance of quality there because it limits spam accounts or potential other abuse of the platform. It also comes with a few issues that I will get into soon. Since 2020, legal work was done to enable sharing of open source solutions in public sector. This was technically not possible before. We started building our digital government in 1991, but it wasn't until 2020 that it was possible actually legally in our administration sectors to share open source code with one another. In many ways, we did it already for years and have been doing it for years for X-Road and EID. It has happened for years, but we didn't have a legal framework around it. Our legal framework for sharing stuff between administration sectors and government sort of offices required immense amount of bureaucracy, and everything was handled as if it's a cup, like a physical object or a pen or a computer, which meant that essentially as open source software was considered to be like a computer, a physical object or a chair or a table. If you are giving this away, now you suddenly don't have it anymore yourself. We didn't have an exception or defined the clarity in our laws and regulations that it's actually sharing public sector code or public open source code is not the same as sharing or giving away a chair. You're still having it yourself, but you're also making it possible for others to use at the same time. So yeah, it took a long time, and we did it primarily because some of the institutions or offices said that it's not possible for us to share stuff. So we had to address it there. So this is one of the main reasons why we did it. But of course, our experience is that the growth is too slow. It's about 40% per year, at least in the past 2 years. This is the rate it has been growing. The numbers are low, as you can see. It's the amount of code repositories that we have there. We have thousands of information systems in Estonia, and as you can see, the code repositories being made available in public is very, very low. And I think not even half of them are actual services that are being used in live. Some of them are test components, some of them are parts of another larger information system. So we have a huge way to go there, but the growth is there at least. And because it's part of our digital agenda for the next 10 years to increase this growth, not at this low rate that we're going at the moment, but at a much, much better rate, then it's definitely something that I hope that not just Estonia internally, but in cooperation with Europe, we can find ways how we can enhance this much, much further than it has ever been before. So some of the problems that have been encountered that we are still really dealing with, and what has been raised as issues and concerns here. For one thing is that cybersecurity is conservative. Public open source code is seen as a risk. This is a mistaken fallacy. Secret is not more secure. Just because you hide a problem doesn't make the problem itself more secure. Technically, it's still possible to be abused, because as long as you might have an awareness of this kind of issue, then the issue is still there. We have actual experiences in Estonia where when we have told the procurement partner that their code is going to be made public, then at that time, they're going to tell us, hey, please hold your horses for a second. Give us a little bit time to polish it a little bit more. Something that they would not have said had we not said that we want to make it published as open source and being made available in public. And this alone already shows that if you make it if you raise the awareness that it's potential for public sector code to be made public, then it actually means that the partner is also more careful about how they're going to build it, because there's no mistaken fallacy that, hey, it's going to be behind closed doors and nobody else other than the company or the public sector organization is going to be using it and has access to this. As long as everything is built in what Jeff Bezos has said, externalizable, so that everybody has potential access to this, then this already means that the code is going to be made and built more securely than ever before, even if it's never actually going to be made public. But a principle that it could be made public is something that assures better security for long term. Legacy code is kept restricted and not made public. This is understood. If you go retroactively and want to make public stuff that doesn't have a proper governance model applied yet, then everybody is very, very conservative. Just taking a code that is internally in internal repository and making it public is an issue. And this is why a lot of the older information systems haven't been made public. Then it's also clear that open source requires more than just publishing and sharing, which I also shared before. Then what we've also realized that there's a low public interest in majority of shared code. I'm going to give a few tips or ways how we can address this in the future, not just in Estonia, but in Europe. But it is indeed true that if you just make public sector sort of niche code public open source, then this might be so niche and such an exceptional little piece that only works for that specific organization and based on whatever their internal configuration is, that nobody actually ever wants to reuse it because it's too specific. It's too tightly mapped to whatever that organization itself uses it for. And this is one of the reasons why the public usually doesn't have interest to stuff that actually cannot be reused, even if you would want to. Then, as I mentioned, this is actually what I was getting to. That software is too specific and niche to be published. Then open source and published open source are two different things, which reflects on what I said earlier, that governance model for both needs to be a partner, but they are separate things. And this is something that sometimes has been an experience of Estonia as well. Most of the public sector code for the very many years, at least, that we've ordered has been made so that the organization that orders or procures this code make sure that the licensing is in their control. And usually this licensing is sure to be open source licensing, either MIT or EU GPL. And this has been worked really well, except most of that open source code that the administration sectors have hasn't been made public. So they have internal repositories with open source code, but that which hasn't been made public for the reasons I've listed here as well. Then access is an issue for international partners. Because we decided to do the code repository available for electronic identity, then international partners, most of them don't have our electronic identity, which means that they can access the code, they can download it, and they can see what's been happening to it, but they cannot contribute themselves. And you need EID to contribute, which is something that we need to handle for the future, because we have a lot of international partners also tied up with our public sector open source projects. Then obviously mirroring can be complicated. There are still internal code repositories, so we don't, most of the administration sectors are not doing their live Git commits on top of our public code repository, but code is mirrored to our public code repository. And last but not least, the good old, yes, I agree, this is a great idea, but, and then come various other minor excuses that maybe in the future, maybe once we have some things set up. So these have been the things on this slide that have kept us back. I'm pretty sure that many governments here, many institutions here have faced very similar issues themselves. So what are the key takeaways? What are my recommendations how to proceed further? And these are the things that have influenced our digital agenda, and some of the things that I think that we're going to try out in Estonia or have them set up as principles in Estonia, but I think that would be beneficial for Europe as well. There are only 3 things here that I'm just going to be focusing on. The first thing is that it has to be understood that no government has enough money to rebuild their digital government every X years. And it does not matter what number you use for the X. No government has enough money to do that, irregardless. And this is very, very important to understand that if your strategy is always to rebuild stuff that is legacy or stuff that is old, and always build everything in a very niche manner, then you are going to hold yourself back. You need to find ways how to reuse stuff. You need to make sure that there is more reuse. You need to make sure that just because the car isn't perfect doesn't mean it cannot drive. You don't need a perfect car for every organization and every administration sector. You need just a car that does what it's like the core purpose, what it's actually for. And then you can actually benefit, because everything that you reuse means save time, not just in money, but all the companies, all the procurement partners that you might have, all the people that are responsible for building this new thing over and over again. It's very important to understand this. Before building something incredibly niche and specific, consider actually reusing something, because no government has enough money. And if you keep rebuilding stuff, you're going to be spending money and you're going to be restricting your progress as a whole. Second thing is that you should really only design, develop, and deploy what you know best. If you are not sure that whatever system you're going to be building or whatever solution you're going to be building is that you are best at this, that you're the best person to do this, you and your team, you and your government, you and your organization, then perhaps you should actually use it as a service instead, rather than building it. To map this other solution, reuse another solution, or pick something from the market to use yourself. So everything else really should be used as a service. This is not a black and white thing. Sometimes you have a hypothesis that you know something better than others, and that this better thing hasn't been built before. This is true. Sometimes the government realizes that we don't actually have this in the market, but we need something exactly like this. It's a great point to start discussion on, but make sure you validate this claim. Analyze it enough, involve experts that are going to be looking at the same problem and saying that, yes, your hypothesis might be correct. Now start building it. Otherwise, don't build stuff that is already out there, that either your government already uses or that perhaps is already available in private sector, if at all possible. And then the third thing is that always always designed for more than just one user, customer, or dependency. One of the key problems why, in our experience, open source code is hard to be shared is because it's been designed so specific, as I mentioned earlier, that it's too specific to be used and reused elsewhere. So as long as you design and build and develop every system in a way that you have more than one user for this, that potential for more than one user, even if you originally design it for a very specific need and very specific user need or governmental service need, then you have to keep in mind that what if someone else wants to use this? One of the key things that we are actually using in Estonia is that whenever we are building a new system, one of our core principles is that we're saying that always consider that you might have more than one user interface. So whatever systems you're building, it's not just one user interface and then the backend solutions and the service stack, but you actually already design it in a way that you can employ other user interfaces on top of the same stack. This is already a great architectural principle that enables more reuse and potential for reuse, because it also avoids the idea of monoliths and stuff that actually cannot ever change. So always design for more than just one. If you design something for a government, like if something has been designed for any kind of government in Europe, like something for Estonia, if we take into account the idea that perhaps some other European country could also use something like this, then we're already winning, not just perhaps for a single country, but for a European economy as a whole. And last but not least, that just making it public and open source is not enough. Ensure governance and ownership. I'm going to reflect this on the very last slide that I added in the last minute, because it was reflected upon the presentation before me that the OSOR recommendations included, which I think is a great sort of set of 4 principles that I'm just going to rehash here, because everybody has said that in every presentation you're going to remember 2 or 3 things at most. Then I think that it's good to repeat these OSOR recommendations here. Support contribution, make sure that everybody is able to contribute in open source. Foster community, deploy governance, incredibly important. Without governance, you're not going to do open source well, and use code repositories. So these are like the sort of overview of Estonian digital government and how we're using open source software and what have been the lessons learned and what could be done better in the future. Aitäh, which is Estonian for thank you. And if anyone has any questions, please, I am available. I'm going to stop the sharing here so that I can actually see the chat or whatnot.
Aitäh, Kristo, thank you very much. I just wanted to add to your great presentation, and I really appreciate that your summary was actually, a shorter version of our recommendations that are not exactly OSOR recommendations. I mean, we of course support it. It's a bigger work under the sharing and reuse framework that Federico already mentioned. That started long ago. The document, it was a bit outdated. We were working on updating it, and it's ongoing work. So this is complex work under our work on interoperability, where sharing and reuse, it's a really important part of that. So those 4 recommendations, these are just part and small part or other recommendations that help tackle problems and challenges that government face when they want to share or reuse IT solutions. So thanks a lot, a great presentation. There are a lot of questions in the chat. So if you find your favorite one to start with, please do so, or Federico can help you to pick some. Also, we encourage participants to just, voice the questions themselves. So Kristo, sorry, could you please choose one to start with?
Yes, I'm going to start from the bottom up. First thing that I'm going to do is that because I'm using Google Drive for the slides, I'm going to actually share these slides right here for you, for anyone that's interested. These were my slide deck that I was showing just a moment ago. All right, there are some questions here from Paolo. Is that, are you also planning to upgrade government desktops to Linux and LibreOffice to improve security and control on data? This is something that we tried years ago it has been incredibly difficult, as I'm sure is shared by a lot of other governments here, that we know that Office is a very, very dominantly rooted in solution across our digital government. And we have been fighting about the principles of using open source software for Office environments as well for years. But it's something that hasn't been really achieved. Originally, we were focusing primarily on the LibreOffice, or originally the OpenOffice, years ago, as something that was deployed and made available on government computers as well. This was years before my time in government. And it was used, but not incredibly widely, because people still tend to fall back into their everyday routines, and it's very hard to break this pattern. And I think that if we aim to break this pattern, on break the idea of vendor locking from, for example, Microsoft, it's something that needs a bigger approach than just enthusiastic members of open source community. I think it needs to be a strategic goal and an economical goal for the value of Europe as a whole. Because I'm not at the same time saying that having stuff that is proprietary is bad. Everybody of us here is using some form of proprietary software, likely more than 50% of whatever devices they use or whatever software they use. We just need to be understand how we can responsible while doing so, and how we can actually make sure that it's maintainable long term. Because I would also say that Microsoft has, for example, been doing strides to also enable stuff that at least the document formats could be open, so that they themselves don't require like Office solutions to use. But this is a really long roadmap, because one of the principles was that don't build stuff yourself that you're not the best at. I think that we need to rely upon the stuff that the market provides for the benefits of our economic sort of whole, I would say. I'm going to turn to other slide questions here. Anna asks, how do you avoid that the open source repository becomes an elephant cemetery? How do you guarantee the relevance and update of the published open source? This is something that has to be done through governance. This was our experience, that just making stuff public wasn't enough. Whoever is publishing code, and this is the same thing that was part of the OSOR recommendations here as well. Without governance, the whole stack falls apart. But by governance, it means that you need to have a dedicated owner responsible for making sure that the solutions are available open source, and that the part that is available open source is also part of their service. It's part of their portfolio. And it's not just about the code dump. It's about the idea that the quality of their service is also partly there. And it's part of their service that they have this transparency and model in place where the code is being made public. This is the way to do it. I think there are ways how government can address this, such as making sure that stuff that doesn't get enough updates after a while is automatically hidden, for example, so that this makes sure that there's at least some metrics in place to make sure that the code is up to date, and someone is responsible for making sure that it is up to date in some way or another, or is dealing with the issues that might be commented on. But without governance model, it won't work. And yes, you're completely correct that without governance model, it will become an elephant cemetery. All right. Then there's a question here by Daniela about, could you please share some examples of successful open source projects in Estonia public admin? I think really in the recent years, one of the most successful parts has been that we're using a thing called Tara. Tara is a gateway, authentication gateway, that was originally set up by our State Information Authority, who is also responsible for our digital identity. There's someone typing, or there's a voice issue somewhere. I'm hearing some loops here.
Please mute yourself if you're not, other people, because I also something.
The Tara is one of the recent ones, and the idea there was that we have a single authentication gateway that is now made available open source and public, that is also being used by some private sector organizations, because they don't need to reinvent the authentication gateways. And it's not just about our mobile identity and our electronic identity, but also, for example, Smart ID, which is provided by private sector. So you can actually find the proper way how you can authenticate your digital identity in Estonia against all of those whatever services want to actually use the authentication gateway. We are actually also providing this with software as a service model, but only for public sector. Private sector is free to pick the code and create their own deploys. The reason for this is because there are financial costs tied to this, especially because of the private sector Smart ID service, as well as for a mobile ID service, which is public sector needs to pay for otherwise. So what we're doing is that this is we're using it as a SaaS model for public sector code, and all the public sector information systems can use this, and private sector can actually take the same code and deploy their own instances of the same solution. But for other examples, we're also using stuff that for example, our X-Road, as I mentioned, and electronic identity is all open source. And one of the interesting things about the governance model, for example, in terms of X-Road, is that a handful of years ago, we made a very precise decision that we're going to give responsibility, the governance model of X-Road's core software and technology, away to a separate organization that is actually being partnered not just by Estonia, but is actually partnered by Finland and Iceland. So we are actually, 3 governments are actually funding a sort of a partner company that is developing the open source X-Road core. And this is also one way how you can assure governance model to be in place, because they are responsible for making sure that the code is high quality and being developed, not just in the needs of Estonia, but in the needs of all the partner countries in Europe. And there are really multiple questions here. I'm going to, because I'll see if I can find next one here, or if there's anything, Federico, that you want me to focus on. Or
there are a couple of questions addressed by Pierluigi. The first one is, does Estonian government contribute to Floss software also, in addition to personal GitHub Codivaramu? And then you also follow up with a comment on the possibility to give freedom to switch from proprietary software to open source.
Yeah, we in terms of Floss, not in terms of government directly. I think we are encouraging contributions for this in terms of our private sector, especially. But this is not a separate strategic agenda as is. I think we are small enough at the moment that the impact is not, I would say, impactful enough. We are still struggling with getting our own code repositories up and running and sharing internally in our public sector to be of high quality enough to have the governance models in place. That I think that once we polish this area of this, then perhaps we can consider wider contributions in terms of Floss. Let's see.
I think that, we should actually think about, having fair share of time for Matthieu for his presentation.
Yes.
And we will have some time after both presentation for, general discussion, your exchange between you, Kristo, and Matthieu. So I would give the floor now to Matthieu, and thank you very much for this for now. And let's go back to discussion on what's going on in Estonia and your experience afterwards. So I encourage participants to still post their questions in the chat. And now, Federico, please introduce Matthieu.
Yes, with pleasure. So Matthieu is an open source project manager at Adullact, that is a French non-profit organization of local governments. Matthieu is also a creator of Asquatasan, apologies for the pronunciation, that is formerly known as Eval Access and Tanaguru. That is basically an open source accessibility analyzer that is reputed for its reliability. Matthieu also volunteers as an instructor at Les Glenans Sailing School, and during this webinar, he will be sharing insights on the work carried out by Adullact to support open source projects across France. Will also share with us some examples, including the creation of a Comptoir du Libre and the efforts made to coordinate public bodies with relevant developers and communities. Matthieu, I will leave the floor to you.
Thank you very much. So let's begin with the screen sharing, hoping this will be good. Can you confirm that you're actually seeing my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, that's perfect. Okay, so let's get into it. Let's get straight into it. First, the presentation of Adullact. Adullact is a French non-profit organization, and it is made of roughly local authorities. From local authorities, we include from tiny villages to regions, from departments through agencies, and even including the French state itself. So we are kind of a national non-profit. A few data about us. We will be 20 years old in a few months. We have 400 direct members, which represent 5,000 local governments, which in turn represent 59 million French citizens. This is for the data. And now I share with you our manifesto, which is based on 3 building blocks. The first one is spare public money, which is something important for all of you, I think. And the second building block is the idea of pooling resources. And the third one, of course, is to use the free and liberal software. So here is it for the presentation of who we are and what we are doing. Now, we will discuss on 2 different aspects on my presentation. The first one is identifying the free liberal software in the public sector, and the second one will be how to build sustainable communities when it comes to free liberal software in the public sector. So this is the first part. Let's get in. What are we talking about, in fact? Are we talking about LibreOffice? Are we talking about Firefox, PostgreSQL, MariaDB, and so on? No, in fact, no. These Libre software are highly interesting, but not on the concern on our scope, because the first one are on the desktop, the other ones are on the infrastructure. And what we are talking about here is actually the software, the Libre software that are dedicated to business needs. Let's give some example. By business need, we are talking about, for instance, cemetery management. Yes, there are software that does cemetery management. We can talk about software that does the transmission, secure transmission. When a city council has made all its decisions, the decisions have to be transmitted to the state in a secure way. There are software that does that. And another example could be the management of the assets of deceased people. There are also software. So you understand, all of these are tiny but numerous software that deals directly with the day-to-day business of the local authorities. So this is what on what we will talk here. Next. As you've seen, we are 20 years old. We have created our own Forge in 2003. By the time it was a Fusion Forge, now it is a GitLab. And it took about, well, at least 10 years for us to identify that our users, our non-developer users, had a hard time when it comes to identifying a software on the Forge. For instance, we had department manager or functional consultant that tried to find an answer to the need, and in fact, that was really difficult for them. We wonder if it was a matter of the software we used for the Forge, and by having changed the software, we discovered that in fact it is not a matter of Forge. So whatever the Forge, could it be GitLab, GitHub, SourceHub, Fusion Forge, whatever you want. In fact, Forges are tools for developers. This is, in fact, not for non-developers. So we wonder if the Forges, as long as they are seen as a tool to identify software, we wonder if this is not a bottleneck, in fact, to the growth of Libre software in public sector. We're not sure to have the answer, but we are wondering of this. And another point is that we are pretty sure that if we had a communication tool, a marketing tool, it could be easier for those profile, the department manager and the functional consultant, for instance, to identify their software. That's the first part. Second part now. Okay. Each week, we roughly have 3 usual questions for our members. And it is roughly, globally, all the same. The first one is, hey, Adullact, do you know software dedicated to that business need? And typically the answer is yes. The second question is, and by the way, should you never know another local authority which is already using it, so we can exchange, discuss, and so that I could understand how they did this and how they migrated and how they get the training done and so on. And the third question is, and by the way, do you know 1 or 2 service providers on that software that could be really useful to us? And those questions are typical. And in fact, we had the answer on those 3 questions. We were really happy to provide our members with that, with those answers. But there was a problem with that, is that all those discussions happened on the phone. And when they are on the phone, they are not written by definition, and they are not shared with other people. So we wanted to have all of these data, this information, written somewhere, for instance, on the web. And so we decided to write it and to make it collaborative. And this is an important aspect, to have these information collaborative. And that's why we created the Comptoir du Libre, which is in fact a web application that aims to help local governments, local authorities share their experiences by having all the answers of the 3 typical questions, so that they can, without us, get to the information. A few data about the Comptoir: more than 400 software, roughly 200 service providers registered, declared as service providers, and valuable comments. The comments are something really interesting, because the local governments share their use or their way to use a software with others. And this is really interesting. At least this is what our members say us, that those comments are really interesting. And at least the Comptoir is itself a free software. Here is a screenshot, so you can identify what it looks like. You've got here for that software at the top description, and then the list of users of local authority already using that software, and then the reviews. The reviews are the comments, in fact, and then the service providers. Oops. The typical question is, once we've presented the Comptoir, is that's great, and are there ongoing challenges? Yes, there are. In fact, most difficult task is to collect testimonies. Collecting those testimonies is kind of hard because it requires a lot of energy. When you've got your members, they are always really happy to share some of their knowledge to other people. But they tell you, well, that's great, I will do that, I promise. But in fact, they sometimes forgot to do it. And once they do not forget, they do it, but with the wrong account. It's with their personal account, not with the account on the collectivity. So this is somehow difficult. So that was the first part on the Comptoir du Libre. Next, the second part of our slides is how to build sustainable communities in public sector. The first question could be, well, that's interesting, but why bother with communities? Isn't it natural? And in fact, it is absolutely not. When it comes to contributing to software like Firefox or LibreOffice as a developer, it is rewardable, it is fun, it is cool for your resume, it is fancy, and you get proud of it. But when, as a developer, you want to contribute to another software, you always ask, is that software sexy? And contributing to software that does symmetry management is absolutely not sexy. So that's why for the public sector, it is highly important to take care of that communities first, and second, to take care of their sustainability. So what we'll share here is our 20 years of trial and error, in fact. We had a lot of trials, you understand, a lot of errors, and here we'll present what have gone right, and for that we will take the example of software, a dedicated software, you understood, that is called Department and Notaries, that does the management of assets of deceased persons, in fact. So let's get in. The very first step when it comes to managing sustainable communities is to have a third party to animate the community, a third party to organize the community. Why is it important? In fact, the local authorities can't do this simply in the long run. They can do the animation, the organization on a given amount of time, traditionally at the beginning of a project, but in the long run, I mean more than 3 years, for instance, it appears that they can't do that. And we've seen that on a lot of projects. And Department and Notaries was in such a case, but we had the opportunity to place that idea from the very beginning. So this is a success. So to have acknowledged for all the stakeholders that we need to have a third party to animate the community. Next point, what we call the no-fork strategy. The no-fork strategy is something important. In fact, you can forget everything we've talked about since now, but the no-fork strategy. The no-fork strategy is maybe the most important part. What do we mean by no-fork strategy? When you have around the table, let's say 10 or 15 local governments wishing to work together around a given software, you gotta explain to everybody around the table that it is highly important to stick to work together. Some some local authorities could say, well, I understand that very well, but I'm kind in a hurry, so I promise I will do that feature on my own, in myself, in my fork, and I promise I will give back to the community. Our experience shows that, in fact, this doesn't work. We have a crucial example on that, on dedicated software ministry. Had the same experience, and they said, we have a lot of money, we have a lot of software, we have a lot of people, well, we have a lot of resources, and so that's okay. Be assured, we will do our own feature and we will give it back to upstream, to the code upstream, and that will be fine. Well, that was 4 years ago, and 3 years after, they recognized that it was an error, that was a mistake, and they even say that it was maybe the biggest mistake they could have made, because they can't get back to the trades, they can't get back to the upstream project. So behind the no fork strategy, we have the idea that it is highly important to have that community to be and to keep to keep being a group, a unified group. So this is highly important. And next, another point which makes your community sustainable is to run what we call the collaborative workshop, the TWRS. What are the workshops for? In fact, they are here for 2 points. First, share experience, and then build the roadmap. Sharing experience is important because as we've seen previously with the comptoir, knowing how your neighbor, the other local authority, the other department made to migrate from that application to our software is important. Understanding how it was for them to deal with all the pitfalls from training, supporting, data migration, and so on. This is highly valuable for the others to understand how that ad has already been made. So this is the sharing experience part. And the second part is building the roadmap. As a community, it is important that this is the community, the workshop itself, that defines what the software will be. So this is the roadmap. So that was the collaborative workshop. There are many other aspects on the workshop. For instance, who's around the table? By who's around the table, I mean who's kind of allowed to be around the table. In fact, in our collaborative workshops, there are members and non-members. I mean, this is open. This is open to all local governments interested in the software we're talking about. Whether they are members or non-members is not important at that point. There is, on the other hand, something important, that around the table, we wish that there is no company. In fact, we want to avoid the "my project is the best one" speech. So we want to provide our local authorities a safe space for discussion, so that they can exchange freely between them. So the who's around the table is something important. We had in the past experiences with companies around the table, and these communities did not succeed. Another question about the workshop. So when do we meet? This may sound kind of a stupid question, but this is not that, this is important, I mean. So we meet once a year with kind of a general meeting. Before the pandemic, it was face-to-face, and now it is kind of remote. We don't know how it will be in the next years, but we were kind of surprised to identify that run remotely, this is kind of good. we have great exchanges and great sharing of information, but we still recognize that something's missing. All the fact that the casual fact you when you're talking with a bunch of coffee, you're exchanging, those exchanges are really valuable. So maybe this is still missing. But well, anyway, meet once a year. We meet at least once a year. And on behalf of this meeting, there is another point, which is having the mailing list. The mailing list is here to help keeping contact between the members, to make announcement or to share various information. So you have kind of a hot meeting, which is the annual meeting, and a cold link, which is the mailing list. And then, who decides the roadmap? That's an important question, in fact. On the who decides the roadmap, here, when it comes to voting, only our members can vote, and this is important. Everyone can discuss, but only our members can vote. This is kind of a jukebox. If you put the coin in, you choose the music. So this is how we explain that to our members. Then next, who is maintaining the software we are talking about? That point is important. A service provider is chosen. It is chosen by the workshop itself. It is not chosen by Adullact. It is chosen by the workshop, the people on the workshop, I mean, and it is paid by Adullact. Those 2 points are highly important because this is on those 2 points we had a lot of issue if we are not doing that. Example, if we do not pay the service provider by ourselves, this is equivalent to giving the key of the software to the service provider. And the service provider is a professional, and that's okay, but its interest is to sell service and not to maintain the community. And maintaining the community costs a lot of energy. So it is important that this is someone different from the service provider that manages the community. Another important point is that how to choose the service provider. It is important that this is the members of the workshop that decide collectively what provider to choose. This is not us, Adullact. These are the members that decide who they want to work with. And to finish, are there also ongoing challenges on the managing our sustainable communities? Yes, of course, there are lots. And behind the lots of challenges that we encounter, maybe there is one bigger than the others, which is the shifted agendas. What I mean is that you have 10 or 20 people around the table, and one is in a hurry because it has to be delivered yesterday, and another is just getting information because the project is for 18 months, and a third one is we are just doing the migration right now. So getting all those people that have different agendas is something kind of difficult. And here we are. So thank you very much for your attention, and I will be pleased to answer questions.
Thanks a lot, Matthieu, for your very interesting presentation. If there is any question from the audience, I mean, you are more than encouraged to take the mic and address the question yourself, or type in the chat. Maybe to break the ice, I will start addressing a question, Matthieu, and it's more related about the degree of maturity in the open source domain that is usually characterizing public administration when they start collaborating with Adullact at the beginning. So do you have more or less a view on how mature are the public administration approaching Adullact for the first time, if they already moved the first steps towards open source, or it's they already mature enough, and what is the relationship with them?
In fact, maturity is something important, but well, maturity is important, but I think more important is how you manage your community. For the example of Department of Notaries, at the beginning, the software was absolutely not mature. It was just a version 0 point something, I don't remember. The software was absolutely not matured, but we had the willing to take an absolute care of that emerging community. And with that, we can see 5 years later that kind of half of departments in France use that software instead of other solutions, and they are using or interested in that software because not because of the majority the software had, but because of the care we put in managing the community. I don't know if this is directly a question, but this point I think is really important.
Thanks a lot for addressing it. Anyone else from the audience who wants to address a question?
I have a question, if I may, because Kristo was mentioned when asked about different projects, but also in his presentation, he was talking about one of them and cooperation with Finland and Iceland. And of course, it's at the national level, then this cooperation looks totally different. And also your work at the regional and local level has a bit different character, and your catalog has a different character. But my question is, do you have any interest from countries or municipalities that are not from France? Because I know we met first in Paris in open source summit, but then so your activities are quite well known in open source communities. So do you cooperate internationally?
That's a good question, Monica. In fact, the answer is that when it comes to things that are related to managing communities or best practices, yes, a bit. And in that sense, OSOR is, and all the work and the documents you provide is an absolutely great help for us. But from a technical point of view or from a business point of view, in fact, it appears that we do not yet collaborate with other countries. We wonder if the barrier is from the legal aspect. By legal aspect, I mean all those dedicated software are created because they are answering a legal need, a need that is created by the legislation, sorry, on a country, and we don't know if the legislation is the same on one country or another. So this question is kind of difficult to answer, in fact.
I understand, but since we have a lot of opportunities to exchange this type of information, I hope that because it's a very good example of what you're doing in Adullact, that it will gain more interest and actually in our other webinars there was a lot of questions like, what about that were addressed to other speakers. that presented their catalogs or their work on open source in their countries. What about international cooperation? So I think that this is important not only at the national level but also local level, because the work is in fact going on the ground in municipalities, cities, and so on. So that's why your work is so valuable, and it's important to share this experience.
Maybe a piece of information, I'll not extend to which, I can go into details, but overall, if I'm not mistaken, more than one of the projects under Adullact had some international traction, interacting with other municipalities throughout Europe. So I don't know, like at Adullact level, but at project level, there are some of them that have been in touch with other public administration throughout Europe. Perfect. Any other question from the audience? Otherwise, please go.
Sorry, Federico, if that's okay, I have a question. So first of all, thank you, Matthieu. Thanks a lot for the super interesting presentation. You mentioned that Adullact is cooperating a lot with local authorities. You mentioned this the software that is currently used by half of French departments, which is quite impressive. And I was wondering whether Adullact is collaborating with the specific department of the French government that is working a lot in the field of open source. I'm thinking about Etalab, which is part of the Digital Affairs Ministry. And so, yeah, could you tell us more on whether and how you're collaborating with them?
Yes, for sure. Maybe a few words before to depict the environment. In France, whether you are ministries or whether you are local authorities, your businesses are different. This is an important part to have in mind before digging into the discussion. Then, well, that being said, yes, we do absolutely collaborate with Etalab, and we have tight relationships with the French OSPO, Open Source Policy Officer, which is Bastien Guéry, and his team. And so we really do work closely with them on different logics, on different aspects, because as I've already said, the business needs are not the same, but yes, we do work together to provide open source solution for the business needs. And for instance, what is a success, I don't know, but it should be a success. We're working on a software called Démarche Simplifiée, which can be seen as a Google Form, but Google Form with sovereignty included, privacy included, and which is business oriented to the public sector. And publics, and in that part, this is highly interesting. So that project was initiated by the Etalab team, and it is still run, of course, and developed by them. And we are contributing to that software, and we are initiating the creation of a collaborative workshop with local authorities to work on that Démarche Simplifiée. So yes, we absolutely collaborate with them, and we are really happy with that.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. I see that Heis had a question was addressed by Pascal. I don't know if Heis, you want to add anything else on top of what you wrote in the chat?
Well, the numbers are presented by by Pascal in the chat. That's right. In fact, there are lots of projects on our Forge. There are something like I don't know the exact numbers, but 2,000 or 3,000 projects. So that's a lot. In the by project, I mean open source free lib software project dedicated to business needs. And when it comes to reusing those software, as my colleague Pascal says in the chat, the most famous is Slow, S2 Low, which we pronounce Slow, which has been reused by more than 11,000 local authorities. So this is there is this is highly reused, and this is the most reused software, but others have high impact. We are just talking about Démarche Simplifiée. Démarche Simplifiée has a huge impact on the ministries first, and then on the local governments, because when you have agencies or organizations that put resources for local governments, and those agencies implement, when those agencies implement Démarche Simplifiée, this has a huge impact over the citizens. So yes, there are lots of reused software, and software on which we are focused on. We are focusing on managing their communities so that they keep running in the long run, as you've understood.
Perfect. Thanks a lot for that. Anyone else from the chat that would like to address an additional question? Otherwise, I have one additional question from the governance point of view. Is there any specific process that public administration partake when formalizing the relationship with Adullact?
I would answer no, but could you precise your question?
So, if there is any, let's say, process to let's say start connecting with Adullact, becoming a member, and so on. So, if there is a formalized governance under that point of view.
Okay. Okay. So, when it comes to a workshop, and you've understood that the workshop is dedicated to one software. In the workshop, everyone is welcomed. Every local authority, I mean, is welcomed. Whether you are a member of Adullact or not, it doesn't matter. So you're highly welcome. And then when it comes to being a member, this is just being a member of a non-profit. So you pay the fee that is based on the number of inhabitants of your local authority, and that's enough. That's okay, and you benefit from the services we offer to our members, and mostly you then gain the right to vote on the workshop. This is as simple as paying the fee for being a member.
Thanks a lot. And I think Daniele has a follow-up question on that, and he's asking how many active collaborative workshops do you have, and if you can share how much money is managed by Adullact for the maintenance development services for these workshops.
Okay, excellent question. I see from Daniele. Well, how many workshops do we manage? I mean, more or less simultaneously. By now, we have 2 highly active workshops, and we have also, let me count, 3, 4 other workshops that are less active, but still active in the long run. So roughly we manage around let's say 6 or 7 workshop, and by workshop I mean softwares. And on the budget, this is a tricky question, not because when it comes to speaking about money, it is not a problem, but all of our job is to put resources. So extracting all the information from the global budget of the Adullact structure and putting it to a given project is kind of difficult. What I can tell you is that our budget, which is public, of the Adullact structure, of the whole structure, is something like 8,100 euros per year. But this in this budget, the workshop is only a part of the budget, and I don't know precisely how to quantify what part is it. For sure, it is less than 50% of that budget. But I must confess, I don't know precisely how to answer that.
I think Pascal is also sharing some additional details on the number of on some numbers on the workshop. Heis has a follow-up question asking what is the French biggest municipality part of Adullact? I think it's Marseille.
We even have Paris. Paris is a member since the beginning. So they are big cities, and Lyon is also a member. So the three biggest cities, Paris, Lyon, Marseille, are members, and they are representative. They are the biggest ones, but more important is that we have a lot of members that are small. Really small or really small local authorities, and those are the ones that we take care the most because they highly need our services and our energy to work on those workshops.
Thanks a lot. So unless there are other questions from the audience, I think we can move on to the next part of the event. And in the second part, we'll be leaving the floor to the two speakers to address questions and foster discussion around those. So the idea is to have a panel discussion. Maybe I can break the ice, addressing the first question to the both of speakers. And asking how, let's say, things are managed differently in between the different countries. So in both presentations, you mentioned a very important principle, basically public money, public code. Is probably applied slightly differently in the two countries. But the question is, what are the barriers to the fully deployment of this principle within the country? For instance, Kristo, you mentioned that there is always ongoing discussion with cybersecurity teams, so there might be some legal framework constraints and so on. So maybe we can start with Kristo and then leave the floor to Matthieu.
Yes, I think that making sure that you have those barriers removed or softened as much as possible is a great starting point. But by itself, that's not enough. As I said, if you build it, they will not come, even if you make it completely easy to share code and reduce and remove all the barriers and restrictions. One of the barriers that we removed, I did mention in my slides, that we had to actually make changes to our law so that open source can actually be shared between administration sector, which was amusing for me because, Estonia being known as a very digital and IT-driven country, I had no idea that open source hadn't been regulated. So this was one of the barriers that we removed. But again, this was a barrier that we removed because someone was saying that this is a problem. And when someone says that it's a problem, then we find a solution for this. And I guess the same applies with these other sort of problems that we've defined. Like if someone says that they cannot or they don't have enough money or resources to do it in order to provide governance, then we have to make sure that there is sort of budget for assuring this kind of governance. Because open source doesn't happen like how to say by itself. You need to make sure that if you are going to make something public, then it comes with an extra price tag. The idea behind it is obviously that this price tag will come back in returns tenfold, if not hundredfold. So this price tag itself is an investment, so to speak, for long term for the government, because someone might pick up this open source code and end up building a new business around it, and perhaps providing this service across border as well to perhaps other governments or even organizations in Europe. But it does require specific attention. I think that for me, based on my experience, the number one thing really is the governance model. It needs to be in place. People that are saying that you need to make this open source need to understand what this actually means. It's not about committing stuff to GitHub. It is about actually making sure that now this is part of your service, that this part of your code and this part of your solution is public. And you need to make sure that this is part of your service that has specific metrics for it, budget for it, and responsibilities and people responsible, assigned responsibilities for this. So because we know that this is part of our digital agenda, what we are doing now is that based on our experience with the code repository that we've set up, we're looking at all the problems that are listed on my slides as well that require addressing, and then deal with them one by one, just like we did with the legislation and law. Now we're going to address the other parts as well. And one of the things that we're definitely going to do is create a specific plan and execution roadmap for this, and then coordinate the execution so to make sure that every administration sector is publishing actual live real use information systems to our public code repository to sort of build the base standard and the practice, and sort of make sure that every administration sector is doing this, and then seeing how we can scale it up even further.
Thanks a lot, and Matthieu, the same question also to you.
Yes. So when it comes to public money, public code, we can see a frank and clearly identified barrier when it comes to public money. In fact, in France, it is all a matter of OPEX or CAPEX. I mean, operation expenditure or capital expenditure or expense. I mean, in the actual world we are living in, when a local government buys, and I say buy, a proprietary software, this can be, from an accountant point of view, be placed as an investment. But when you want to invest in an open source or libre software, this can't be placed as an invest. This must be placed or defined as an operation expense. And this is absolutely counterintuitive, because when you're building libre software, you're actually building something that is here to last over the years, and that is collaboratively built. So the regulations is a clear barrier that limits the efforts that local governments can do from a financial point of view. And this is first a limit, and other people say this limit is even more unfair because you're allowed and entitled to kind of invest, with the quotes, on proprietary software while you are absolutely not entitled to invest in open source or libre software. So this is kind of a difficulty, yes. Is that okay for you, Federico?
Sorry, I was muted and I was keep talking. Apologies. Yes, I was saying thanks a lot. Very insightful information from the both of you. Maybe I will leave the floor to the audience if they have additional question. Otherwise, I have plenty of them because indeed your presentation was very insightful. Anyone from the audience who would like to address a question to the speakers? Then I will go ahead maybe and ask one myself. It's about the repository. I mean, thanks a lot for explaining what's going on in both instances and detailing what is the operating model and the governance behind. The question is about more the future developments that you envisage for your national repositories. Maybe we can invert the order and start with Matthieu this time.
Sorry, I could not get your question.
What are the future developments that you envisage for Comptoir du Libre?
Great. In fact, the Comptoir du Libre is being refactored. It's just begun. All the three building blocks are still the same. The software, then the users, the local govs, and then the service providers. All those three building blocks are being the same, but we are working on technical aspect, and we will improve the usability of the whole software. So we obtain a more precise map of the various businesses and more on the actual use from the ground that the local authorities do with their Libre software.
Thanks a lot. And Kristo, and the same question to you.
Yeah, as I mentioned in my presentation as well, that we're dealing with two things, primarily in terms of the platform for code sharing. One of them is to make sure that you can contribute without having the electronic identity of Estonia. It's a huge issue because the original idea was that we are going to limit spam and the potential security threats as a result of this. But I guess because we need to also involve sometimes procurement partners from both Europe and international, it is something that we need to address to make sure that you can contribute even when you don't have electronic identity. This is one of the things. And the second thing is obviously the binary repository, which is going to be absolutely huge and very, very important. I covered this slightly in my presentation as well, but anyone that has been joining midway through, the idea there is that in terms of open source software, sometimes the source isn't open, but the software itself could be. So in terms of like machine learning, in terms of generated models, black boxes, and generated binary knowledge, these are things that you can't read line to line, but you can still, and you really should, have solutions that can be reused that are these kind of shared binaries. And this is going to be very critical in terms of machine learning and AI for not just Estonia, but for Europe as a whole. So we need to find ways how we can do this binary sharing using similar but not the same governance model due to security reasons. So we are setting up that angle for our platform as well. So both sharing code and then also sharing the binary knowledge or generated binary knowledge that can be reused and implemented in various information systems in Estonia.
Thanks a lot for this answer. But I have a question that is linked a bit to that about searchability of the platform, especially when the binary one, because I understand that, you know, this additional information that will be available there, how are you going to tackle the issue of searchability? So, you know, you're saying that it's not enough, you know, to put things out there to make sure that people will come, but if they come, how can they be sure that they will find the right information? Because from Matthieu's presentation, we could see that they focuses on really on business needs of local administrations. So you will have people that will look at your platform and will come with certain goal and with certain business needs. So how it is going to be tackled?
Yeah, it's all about the governance model. It's about having good practices. How if you make something public, as I said, it becomes part of your service. And as long as it becomes part of your service, you need to have separate metrics for this, both user satisfaction rate metrics, as well as like other quality metrics that might be reasonable to be applied. You need to make sure to see how many are using your published either binary or code. You need to make sure that if they want to give feedback, how to give feedback, and you need to make sure that the governance model assures that the documentation is of high quality. If you don't have these minimum sort of requirements set or principles set for any code that is published in public code repository or in the binary repository, then it's going to become, as was quoted earlier, this elephant cemetery, which is something that we need to avoid. So having these standards in place, and then whoever is responsible, in our case, it's going to be responsibility of both my department and the State Information Authority, who's responsible for our central platform tools in digital government, including Xroad and including electronic identity. Then it's our responsibility to assure that the platform's own principles and sort of minimum requirements are being upheld by anyone that is contributing to the platform. And again, as I said, the governance is important for whoever is publishing, but it's also important to assure governance for the platform itself. And with this cooperation, a lot of big things can actually succeed. But definitely the goal is to, and I'm going to steal this from this webinar, this elephant cemetery. So I'm going to be using this internally as well.
Yeah, indeed.
Sorry, may I add a few words on that? It's Matthieu.
Yes, of course, you are more than welcome.
Thank you. Well, I would like to add a slightly different point of view. What we're working on is fostering the communities and make them sustainable and let them happen. I highly understand the needs of quality that Kristo presents, but if you don't open the code, it is much more difficult to gather people around something that is not viewable, not touchable. By having code publicized, publicly available, you help people come naturally to you. And yes, there are issues. They may have security issues. Yes, that's absolutely true. But that's not kind of a problem. I don't mean security is not important. That's not my point. I mean that when compared to building a community on the long run and a security problem that is really short term, I think we should prefer the long run. In fact, in department notaries, this is exactly our experience. We had security issues, and honestly, we had security issues that developers were absolutely not proud of, but the code was publicized, and that was okay. This is it. This is documented. If anyone want to help, help is appreciated and contributions are welcome. And this created the opportunity to build the really first blocks of the very first steps of the community, having different French departments working together on the same issue, a security issue. And they did not have the habit to do so. But thanks to that security issue, they had the opportunity to do it. And that created the very first block and really solid, rock solid block of the community.
Perfect, thanks.
Sorry, Federico. I have one question for both speakers. We heard about the most used solutions, and I wanted to ask both speakers, what do they think? What is like the type of IT solutions that you think should be made available in priority to other public administration as open source, to increase interoperability?
Yes, thank you, Claude, for this question, because we are in general umbrella of interoperability, so I appreciate this question.
Well, that's not a small question.
Indeed.
Yes, we do have an answer and feelings about the subject. I think there are obvious things and less obvious things. The most obvious is open formats. The formats when it comes to files is highly important. When it comes to desktop, for instance, the open document format from the TDF, the Document Foundation, seems highly important. And having the public sector using that format would be a great help, not a great, absolutely huge help for the interoperability. This is the first part, and the kind of citizen part. Another part, maybe less obvious or less visible, less viewable by the public, is all the API, the ability to exchange between various software, even if they are close to software, but having the API and a documented API, I think is something highly important. And once you put the finger on the APIs, we will quickly identify that having APIs that are enhanceable, improvable, we will discover that the best way to achieve this goal is to use Libre software, I think.
Yeah, from my side, regarding like what should be the priorities or the core focus at first, it's definitely everything that is more fundamental and more general, either for the government or organization or for Europe. Everything that should be shared, that should have multiple users. This is why one of the main key takeaways that I pushed in my slides is that always design new systems and solutions so that you have more than one user for this and more than one possible benefactor from this. Because this means that you are going to get something that can actually be successful in open source environment. And this is why Estonia's case, the core foundational technologies are open source for the same reason, because everybody needs to use it. Because if we had done it differently, then we would have alternative solutions for almost everything. And we really think that in order to create interoperability, not just within a government or an organization or across Europe, then everything that should be used or should be made compatible with should obviously be open source and should be the priority number one. Sometimes when we've been discussing this in our government with our various partners as well, is that sometimes people are saying that, hey, but perhaps it's not just open source, but perhaps it's also like open standards and open protocols. And this is also true. For example, in terms of our interoperability platform, then you can use Xroad protocol without using the rest of Xroad technology stack. And that's also important, that we should not forget about the idea that sometimes the open standards are a way to get to open source. And then from open source, it's a way to actually get to much more enhanced and increased use of open source across the whole sector or multiple sectors. So everything that technically, the brief answer is that everything fundamental, everything that is platform specific, and that should be central rather than very specific to like administration or administration sector or a specific field. So everything that could be used in a more standardized way should be open source and should be the priority first.
And if I may add a few other points, I forgot two important points. Another one, once we've talked about APIs, we must directly talk about open data. Open data is highly important, and providing all those data sets in a public way with the correct license, with a correct license, is highly important for many reasons. It is not time to discuss here, but it is important. This is another part. And another part also is all the map aspect. All what is related to creating maps, building maps, having data on maps, and providing the users or publishing from the public sector the information it has in the correct format with liberal license is highly important. This could be summed up in a way which could be: is my map or the object on my map can be contributed to OpenStreetMap? If it can be, it is good. If it can't be, is well, that's a pity. But there are a huge part of public sector that relies on maps and objects that are getting on maps.
Thanks a lot for this addition, and thanks, Kristo. And actually, with those answers of both of you, where you mentioned, how open source, open data, open protocols, open standards are intertwined and important, and in many cases can't exist with one with another. We would like to finish because this is really a strong and important statements and links to my opening when I mentioned that interoperability expert group that works with the Commission really recommends all of us to work more on promoting those. So this would be my closing message. Together with repeating our four recommendations that we chose from the sharing and reuse framework for IT solutions that Kristo nicely put in a shorter way in his presentation. In full, we are talking about how important it support the communities and encourage contributions. So foster the open source communities, use code repositories, but not only that, because we're talking also about binary repository of Estonia and catalogs that actually make it easy for public administration users to find solutions that they need, and also that the governance is pivotal in all those processes. So thank you very much to both the speakers for your great presentations and being open, for your open, honest accounts, all that you reveal also all the roadblocks and challenges that you face and you have to overcome. This is actually probably the most valuable part of our exchanges here that we try to organize in OSOR. So thank you to all participants, and thank you to both speakers, and thank you for bearing with me today. I'm not really with it today, but I really enjoyed that webinar, and I hope you had the same feelings. Federico,
Thanks a lot, Monica, and of course, thanks a lot to Matthieu and Kristo. So maybe just a few additional information before closing the meeting. Just for your information, on OSOR, we recently published 2 new country reports. So with those 2 now, we reached a total of 27 reports from the member states, plus additional 17 on different countries throughout Europe. And in the upcoming days, probably within this or next week, there will be additional publication onto the OSOR, and more specifically, there will be a report on the role of open source during COVID-19, with some insights and different case studies within it. And it will be more focusing on the health and education sector. And finally, there will be also the updated version of the guidelines on the sustainable open source community in the public sector. I mentioned that before at the beginning of the presentation. So this will be the 2021 version. So if you wish to receive, let's say, updates on the latest publication on OSOR, you can turn on the RSS feed or simply subscribe to our newsletter. You will receive it once a month, and it will contain all the main takeaways of the previous 4 weeks. So before closing the meeting, just some additional question to the audience, actually. As you know, we carry out events, but we are always keen to collect feedback from you. So if you have in mind any topics that should be addressed in the next OSOR webinar, please do not hesitate to drop it in the chat. Or if you're aware of any public administration that is successfully involved in the open source domain and is willing, of course, to share their experiences with OSOR or with the broader audience as today, do not hesitate to get in touch with us. And if you are looking for venues to reach out to us, you can write an email to eu@eceuropa.eu, or you can use any of the other channels that are mentioned in the slide. So you can become a member of the OSOR community. You can sign up for the OSOR, to the OSOR newsletter, activate your RSS feed, and of course, we always post onto Twitter, and our account is osor.eu. So once again, I want to thank you, all of you, for being here, and a special thank you to the speakers. It was a real pleasure to have you with us today, and also to hear about your experiences. So thanks again.